Today, we're going to talk about 15 mistakes we can make when decorating our small space. Let's get started. To decorate our small space, whether it's a dining room, a bathroom, whatever it may be, there is a golden rule. Leave free space, don't overcrowd the rooms, and make the most of every corner. So together with an interior designer, we've made a list of 15 common mistakes and how to solve them. The first and most obvious mistake would be not planning our space. This mistake is the beginning of all mistakes when it comes to decorating our small space. Because before starting any decoration, what we need to do is analyze that specific room, what it will be used for, how many people we are, and the possible types of use we will give it. And by analyzing all of this, we will end up with an efficient and, above all, functional space, adapted to everything we need in our daily lives. And in addition, saving a bit of money on things that don't benefit our small space. For example, when it comes to choosing a sofa, if only 2 people live together, we can choose a 2 or 3-seater sofa instead of going for a large 4-seater sofa. Once our space is well planned, we would move on to the next mistake, which would be number 2. And this would be using large-size furniture. As we mentioned before, the sofa is a great example of this type of large furniture in a small space. To avoid this, you have to take measurements of all the spaces and look for the furniture that best fits our room. After all, the layout of the space also affects comfort. In other words, a piece of furniture should never prevent us from moving freely around the place. When we need a small sofa, we should take the opportunity to invest in a subtle piece with low backs, comfortable, and with personality. This also happens with dining tables. The best option is to choose tables with extendable pieces and complement them with folding chairs, so that when there aren't many diners, everything takes up as little space as possible. Be careful with bedrooms too, because the lower the bed and the rest of the furniture are, the higher the ceilings will seem. In short, what we need to do is choose furniture that is proportional to our space and allows us to move around freely in it. The third mistake would be having too many things in that space. The goal of choosing smaller furniture is to give the room a bit more breathing space, trying to respect and maintain empty spaces. Empty space is also a very important concept when it comes to decorating walls, shelves, and other areas. Many times less is more, and sometimes we tend to overload and accumulate things. Therefore, you should leave some walls free of decoration or avoid overloading shelves. This will create a much more spacious feeling. Ultimately, we need to try to respect and maintain empty spaces, creating flexible areas. This would lead to the next mistake, which would be overusing mirrors or overloading them. It is true that mirrors are the best accessory to make a room feel much larger, and they reflect the natural light from outside. But you always have to be careful with this. You need to think very carefully about their placement and consider what you are going to reflect. For example, we can place it in such a way that it reflects a light-colored wall or a window. The next mistake would be mixing too many styles. When we have a small space, a mix of styles or going overboard with trends can work against us. It can create a heterogeneous feeling in our home. For example, using a bow style in our living room, which is a bit ornate, and then using a more classic style in a bathroom. Well, this combination could be a bit too much. For a house or a small space, it's always best to try to keep a uniform style, a cohesive look throughout all the rooms. By applying a color palette, for instance. With the same harmony, we can unify spaces and create the feeling of a large room with different divisions. Simply by unifying styles, you create a harmonious and balanced atmosphere. Everything is associated with spaciousness. Closely related to this, we come to the next mistake, which would be overdoing it with colors or fabrics. Walls painted in bright different colors, or covered with very busy wallpaper, or with very colorful patterned curtains. We must avoid these situations. Since in small spaces, we have to limit the use of colors, at most to 3, and use accessories where we can add touches of color, but always without overdoing it, using relaxing tones and fabrics. Cushions, rugs, curtains, and table decorations are important pieces when it comes to creating that calmer, more relaxing feeling, and making quality stand out in our small space. The next mistake would be using furniture in dark and neutral tones. Furniture with dark tones tends to make spaces look smaller since they don't reflect light and actually reduce it. This usually happens when you always try to avoid the all-white trend. By adding bulky furniture like a large sofa or a sideboard or a table with a very dark color, you disrupt the balance of light tones in the rest of the furniture. You have to be careful with this because not all small spaces can handle this mistake. The best thing is to choose colors and materials in light tones, which create balance and warmth. This doesn't mean you can't add color, in fact you should, but always in small doses. The next mistake is closely related to this one. Finishes and materials with little brightness. At first glance, a house or a small space in general may seem more difficult to decorate. We choose finishes more intuitively based on what we like aesthetically, and we use more basic materials, but in these cases, the finishes and materials you choose are the key. To achieve this, there are some foolproof tricks. If you want to visually enlarge a room, materials like glass play a very important role in lighting. For example, in a living room, we would choose a side table with a glass structure and wooden legs. A light tone, making it reflect the light and brighten up the living room. The next mistake, which would be the ninth, would be not paying attention to the lighting. This type of mistake doesn't just happen in small houses, but it's also made in large ones. Lighting will be the key to creating functional spaces. First, we need to consider what lighting is appropriate for each area, depending on the activity we do there. In the kitchen, where more detailed work is done, we need more light, so we would use more focused lighting. However, on the sides of the sofa, where we usually watch television, we would normally need more indirect and softer lighting. We need to think carefully about how we are going to use each space and create different atmospheres according to their needs. And never forget that the general lighting should always be correct. The next mistake seems very important to me and something to keep in mind, and that would be having different floor tones. We might find that in a small room, the floors can be completely different. For example, in an open-plan kitchen, the floor can be totally different from the living room. This creates high contrasts and visual boundaries that don't help at all, since we perceive the space as even smaller than it actually is. What we should always aim for is uniformity, using, for example, colors from the same family. The transition between floors will be much smoother, and we'll perceive the different rooms as a whole, and everything will feel much more spacious. The next one, which is closely related to the previous point, would be forgetting to use rugs or using them inappropriately. Rugs, just like flooring, create visual boundaries, and therefore, not choosing the right one could make a space feel smaller. If we choose a rug that's too small for a room, the space might look even smaller, instead of perceiving a room as unified and harmonious. However, if we put down a large rug, making sure all the furniture fits on it will feel like the rug is included in this small composition, and the same thing would happen with color. As we've said, if we're looking for maximum contrast, we might find that the visual boundary makes the room feel smaller. The next mistake would be related to curtains. Curtains that are poorly placed or poorly planned. Badly hung curtains have a big impact on how we perceive a space. This mistake happens when we have a standard height ceiling and the curtains end up being hung close to the window frame. The most recommended thing is to hang them from the ceiling all the way down to the floor. This creates an effect of very high and stylish ceilings, and the windows are better positioned in a small space. The height of the curtains isn't the only important thing, but also choosing the right fabric. If the fabric is very opaque or heavy, with dark tones or patterns, it won't let any light through, creating a much smaller and very dark space. But if the fabric is lighter, with a nice drape and mostly light tones, it benefits the visual effect and makes the place feel more spacious. The next mistake would be thinking only horizontally, without taking advantage of the verticality of our walls. When organizing our space, we usually think about the horizontal part and about using all our available floor space. Even if it's a small space, this is a big mistake because starting to think vertically in a small space is very advantageous. Thinking this way will end up making much better use of the walls and ceilings. For example, we can make use of the walls vertically by adding shelves or custom carpentry. We can also hang lamps and thus avoid placing them on the floor. We can add folding tables and chairs or place plants near the windows. This way, the floor surface won't be overcrowded and there will be much freer circulation. We have to make the most of every corner. The next mistake has everything to do with storage. Storage is a vital point when it comes to small spaces, since with little space, many things tend to be left out or exposed. This can end up creating a messy environment or a buildup of dust or dirt. As we mentioned before, it's extremely important to make use of spaces to place shelves. And as a tip to avoid that feeling of disorder, we would use storage items like wicker, jute, wood, or fabric boxes. Of course, always trying to maintain a balance of light tones. And the last mistake would have to do with the absence of natural plants. Many times we don't consider the option of coloring our spaces with natural elements, and we end up giving more importance to material decoration. In fact, plants can create a completely different atmosphere in our space. But which plants should we choose? Well, preferably we shouldn't place large plants on the floor, since they can obstruct movement in the area, as we've mentioned. It's better to choose small plants, which can be hung from the ceiling or the wall, or even placed on a shelf, next to a window, decorating a table or central furniture. This way, we make the room feel more natural and add a splash of color. And these would be then the 15 most common mistakes we might find when decorating our room. I hope this has been useful for you, and I'll see you in upcoming videos. See you soon.